It was one of those early fall nights in Brooklyn when the rain doesn't pour but lingers. A fine mist soaking into the sidewalk, pooling along the edges of stairwells, dripping from the overhangs of the elevated train lines. The kind of night where everything feels quieter, slowed. At 7:16 p.m., a girl stepped off the curb near Marcy and Myrtle, umbrella half folded, backpack snug on her shoulder, and ducked into the underground entrance to the Green Line subway. Her name was Talia Brenner. She was 17, just weeks away from her 18th birthday. And by all accounts, by every teacher, classmate, and neighbor who'd eventually be interviewed, she was the kind of teenager who showed up for class, showed up for her little brother's school recital the week before, showed up for a friend who'd been dumped just that morning. That's who she'd gone to see, a classmate from her art elective who lived a few stops away. They'd talked, ordered Chinese takeout, and shared stories about where they wanted to be next fall. Talia had mentioned she was staying up late to finish her college applications. She said she wanted to get into Syracuse, maybe even Cornell. At 7:32 p.m., she sent her last known message, just 4 words. "Train's here. Heading back." Her friend replied with a heart emoji. It would go unread. The turnstile captured her MetroCard swipe. A camera in the mezzanine level recorded her briefly, wiping her glasses and adjusting her coat. She wore a green hooded sweatshirt with the word Midwood stitched across the front. There was nothing unusual, no one following her, no sign of distress. She moved with purpose. She boarded the southbound train at Platform 3, and then she disappeared. The subway line she rode was one of the oldest in the city, half modernized, half forgotten. Somewhere between Station 14 and Station 15, deep underground, her phone lost service. At 7:42 p.m., it sent out its final ping to a nearby tower before shutting off completely. The signal was somewhere between 2 stops, no surface streets, no nearby exits, no known access points for pedestrians, just steel, brick, and dark. When Talia didn't come home that night, her mother assumed the worst, but not that kind of worst. Maybe she'd gone to a second friend's house, maybe her phone had died, maybe the rain had thrown everything off. But by morning, when the bed was still made and the phone was still off, her mother drove straight to the precinct. She sat down with 2 officers, one of whom asked if Talia had a boyfriend. She didn't. Then they asked if she'd been acting out, if there had been recent fights. There hadn't. They noted that she was 17, legally old enough to leave home. One officer asked, almost gently, could she be running away? Talia's mother didn't yell. She just stared. Then she pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents, AP scores, art portfolios, printed emails from college advisors, essays with red pen edits. "This is a girl who wanted to go somewhere," she said. "She didn't run. Something happened." Still, the report was filed as a voluntary missing person. Standard policy. Unless there were signs of foul play, the case would be classified as non-critical. No Amber Alert, no press conference, no organized search. 2 days passed before a detective was assigned. He called the transit authority and requested all footage from the southbound Green Line for the time window. The MTA responded that not all trains had onboard cameras. Some platforms had coverage, others didn't. It was a patchwork system, frustratingly inconsistent. They found her entering the station. They did not find her exiting, not at her destination, not at any stop. The detective requested a trace on her MetroCard, no further swipes. The phone company confirmed no calls, no texts, no data since 7:42 p.m. GPS was useless underground. The location history just stopped. Within the week, posters appeared along intersections and storefronts. Her parents printed over 2,000 flyers. Her father drove the train route every day, counting stops, staring out into the darkness between stations, wondering if he'd missed something. Riders began reporting vague memories. A girl with glasses, maybe reading a book, maybe standing near the door. No one remembered her getting off. No one remembered her talking to anyone. Local news picked it up briefly. Teen disappears on subway route. But without footage or a clear suspect, attention drifted. People moved on. The city did what cities do, swallowed noise and grief and moved forward. But the Brenners didn't. Talia's mother stopped working. Her father started keeping a spreadsheet of reported subway crimes, hoping to find a pattern. Her younger brother began sleeping with the hallway light on. Her room stayed exactly as it was. 3 weeks later, a transit police officer privately admitted to the detective something strange, something he didn't write in his report. He'd worked that line for years. Back in the early 2000s, there was a stretch of tunnel between Station 14 and Station 15 with a door. Not one on the maps, not an official one, but he swore he saw it once during a maintenance ride. A door embedded in the tunnel wall, painted the same color as the concrete. He tried to find it again years later, but it was gone. Or maybe sealed. Maybe someone covered it up. He said it like a joke, like a ghost story, but the detective didn't laugh. He circled that area on the route map, and he underlined one word in his notebook: missing. That was just the beginning. The subway system under New York is an intricate web of noise and movement, but parts of it, especially older lines, are stitched together with patches of neglect. Surveillance isn't consistent, upgrades come slow, and in some places, decades of infrastructure remain untouched, buried beneath budget cuts and bureaucratic maps that no longer reflect the real ground. That's where Talia Brenner disappeared, into one of those places. The Green Line's digital footprint was supposed to be easy to follow. It wasn't. Officers began by requesting all available station footage for the evening of September 22nd, starting with Station 12, where Talia had entered, and moving stop by stop along the route. The problem became immediately clear. The system was incomplete. Some platforms had updated high-definition cameras. Others hadn't been upgraded since the mid-90s. A few were entirely offline that night due to maintenance errors no one had documented clearly. Still, they pieced together what they could. The footage from Station 12 clearly showed her entering, time-stamped 7:16 p.m., umbrella dripping, sweatshirt damp at the sleeves. At Station 13, several passengers who matched the manifest of that train were captured exiting. A few witnesses were identified and interviewed. Most didn't remember anything unusual. One woman thought she'd seen Talia sitting near the rear of the train, earbuds in, sketchbook open. A man vaguely recalled a girl who fit her description standing by the door, staring at her reflection in the window. Both said the same thing. They never saw her get off. That's where the trail broke. There was no working footage at Station 14. And between Station 14 and Station 15, the system went dark. No platform, no exit. Just a 7-minute stretch of tunnel, nearly 2 miles long, with no public access, no scheduled stops, and no visibility. The detective checked the internal system logs and found something troubling. There was no indication of a service disruption, but something didn't add up. The train Talia boarded had been recorded entering Station 13 at 7:39 p.m. and leaving Station 15 at 7:49 p.m. Normally, the trip between those stops took just under 6 minutes. That night, it took nearly 10. No explanation, no alerts. Dispatch logs showed nothing unusual. No driver report, no mechanical delay. Just a slightly longer than average dwell time in the tunnel, chalked up to congestion. But to Talia's parents, it felt like a hole. A request was made to access train car footage. That led to another dead end. The specific train that night, Unit 216B, was one of the older models, still operating without interior surveillance. Budget approvals for upgrades had been delayed for years. The only working camera that night had been at Station 12, the beginning of the ride. There were no confirmed visuals of Talia after she stepped on. The tech division pulled her phone records again. They confirmed the last ping, 7:42 p.m., deep inside that same tunnel. The GPS had no resolution, just a faint dot somewhere between two stations under nearly 60 feet of street and concrete. After that, nothing. The signal went cold. For her parents, the phone was more than just a lost device. It was proof she was alive, at least until then. Her mother kept checking the call log, reading over the last texts, as if something had changed, as if a new message might appear. She held on to the battery report from the provider. The battery hadn't simply died. It had been powered off manually. Meanwhile, transit officials began to review schematics of the area between Station 14 and 15. What they found added a layer of discomfort. Though the public system showed a smooth tunnel run, older blueprints, dating back to the 1960s, listed several irregularities: 2 obsolete maintenance alcoves, 1 decommissioned ventilation chamber, and something called Access Point Delta 5. No one in the current MTA administration could confirm what that was. Retired workers were called in. Some remembered stories, others denied the existence of anything unusual. One former supervisor mentioned a hatch installed during Cold War-era upgrades, meant to serve as an emergency shelter. Another claimed there were crawl spaces running behind the tunnel walls that hadn't been accessed in decades. But no one could agree on where those entrances had been, or whether they were ever truly real. The detective took a small team underground. It was unofficial, barely approved. They walked the rails during off hours, flashlights scanning the walls. There was nothing obvious, just rusted emergency signage, occasional drainage leaks, and thick layers of grime. But near mile marker 28-7, right around the area where Talia's phone had last pinged, one officer noticed something odd. A section of wall that didn't match the surrounding tunnel. Newer concrete, smooth finish. It looked like it had been patched recently, though no permit had been issued in years. They took photos. A formal request was filed to allow partial excavation of the spot. The city denied it. No budget, no immediate threat to infrastructure, and still, officially, this wasn't a criminal case, it was a missing persons file. Frustrated, the detective logged everything. But with no further evidence, no cause for a warrant, and no sign of foul play, just silence. The momentum stalled. Talia's father kept riding the line. He rode it every Thursday the night she vanished. He'd watch the doors open and close at Station 13, then 14. He'd sit frozen during that 7-minute gap between tunnels, staring out into the black, trying to see past the reflections. Once, as the train slowed for no apparent reason, he saw something outside, just for a second. A faint mark on the wall. Could have been rust. Could have been graffiti. But it looked like a circle. Inside it, a single handprint. He told himself it wasn't real, but it was enough to keep going. 3 months after Talia vanished, the public momentum was already fading. Local coverage had slowed to a trickle. Flyers were curling at the corners. The detective stayed on the case, but even within the department, it was beginning to feel like another file headed for cold storage. Then, on a quiet afternoon in January, a message came through the precinct's general tip line. Not from a witness, not from someone claiming to know Talia, but from someone who knew the tunnel. The man's name was Richard Halverson, 72 years old, retired MTA engineer. He'd seen the news coverage on a rerun segment, the one showing the map of the subway line and the unexplained blind spot between Station 14 and Station 15. His message was short, typed all in lowercase. That stretch used to have a maintenance corridor running parallel. It was sealed off in '97. It's not on your modern schematics, but it's there. Or it was. When the detective called him, Halverson didn't sound eager for attention. He sounded tired. He explained that in the 1960s and 70s, that section of tunnel had housed a utility corridor, narrow, damp, and lined with rusted pipes and electrical junctions. It had been used primarily for storage and emergency access, but it was mostly obsolete by the late 80s. After several budget cuts and complaints about asbestos, the city walled it off during structural upgrades in 1997. Officially, it was no longer part of the system. Unofficially, Halverson wasn't so sure. He remembered a side door, plain metal, painted gray, no label. A few times during inspections, he'd found it ajar. He assumed it was just bad maintenance, but once, he said, he saw something strange. A set of boots, muddy, newer than expected, inside that corridor. No sign of a worker. No response when he called out. The next time he checked, the door had been welded shut. The detective asked for location specifics. Halverson couldn't remember the exact marker, but he narrowed it to somewhere between mile 28.5 and 29.1, right in line with Talia's last phone ping. With fresh urgency, the department put in a request to conduct a second sweep of the tunnel, this time with canine units. They scheduled it for a Sunday night just after 2 a.m. when train traffic would be lowest. The team included the detective, 2 transit officers, and a pair of handlers with cadaver dogs, both trained to detect human remains even through layers of concrete. They walked the stretch slowly. Flashlights scanned the grime-streaked walls. The dogs sniffed methodically, each tugging slightly on the leash as they passed drainage grates and old junction boxes. At mile marker 2872, one dog paused, ears raised. The handler leaned in, but after a few seconds, the dog moved on. No signal, nothing definitive. The detective stopped anyway. He stepped closer to the wall. That patch of concrete, just like before, looked different, smoother, cleaner, as if someone had resurfaced it in the last 10 years. He took a photo, marked the spot again, filed a report. The response was the same. No active permits, no budget approval, no way to justify excavation without probable cause. A week later, a user on a subway enthusiast forum posted an old blueprint someone had scanned from microfilm. It showed a side corridor labeled Utility SVC-17D, running parallel to the Green Line for about 200 feet, ending in a walled section just before Station 15. Commenters debated whether it still existed. One mentioned urban explorers had tried accessing it through an old airshaft years ago, but found it sealed. Another claimed to have heard a rumor that one of the doors wasn't locked until the early 2000s. The detective took screenshots and filed them into the case notes. Then something else surfaced. An anonymous message arrived at the tip line. No name, no callback, just a short paragraph. Check the hatch near 28.7. It's not on the maps. It's not sealed. Wasn't always locked. That was it. No more detail. The detective requested IP trace. It came from a public library terminal in Queens, scrubbed through a VPN. Dead end. But now there were two claims, one from a retired engineer, another from a nameless tipster, both pointing to the same stretch of tunnel. The phrase "wasn't always locked" lingered. It implied access, re-entry, use. He brought the tip to his supervisor, pushed for a targeted dig. But again, the request hit the same wall. No probable cause, no recovered body, no confirmed evidence of a crime. It was speculation, circumstantial. And unless the wall started bleeding, no one was going to tear into 60-year-old infrastructure on a hunch. But unofficially, the detective made a decision. He started showing up on his own time, walking the tunnel stretch again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with off-duty colleagues. He'd bring a measuring tape, a thermal scanner borrowed from a friend in search and rescue. He recorded the temperature across the tunnel surface, logging slight fluctuations. Most were explainable: leaks, airflow, variance in materials. But twice, at mile marker 28.7, he picked up a patch that ran cooler than expected, about 6 degrees colder. A possible cavity behind the wall. He couldn't prove it, but he could feel it. Whatever was behind that section, whatever used to be there, or still was, it wasn't just history. Something was buried behind that tunnel. And someone had once had the key. Talia's mother stopped waiting for the city to care. By the start of spring, 6 months after the disappearance, she was done with phone calls that led to nowhere. She was done with hearing the phrase, "We're doing everything we can." Her name was Miriam Brenner, 43 years old, a public school teacher in East Flatbush, and she'd spent every afternoon since September going to work and every evening chasing ghosts beneath it. She started with who she knew. A former student of hers worked sanitation overnight and had keys to several trackside access gates. He introduced her to a retired transit foreman who still had his old tunnel maps taped together in his garage. That man pointed her to a forum where hobbyist urban explorers shared photos and coded directions for every forgotten stairwell and sealed platform in the 5-borough subway system. Miriam read every post. She copied photos, highlighted file names, and made a spreadsheet, color-coded by location and proximity to Talia's last signal. In the evenings, she printed flyers, handed them out to riders, and rode the same line over and over, taking notes on where the train slowed and where it didn't. One night, she met a young man named Leo who tagged murals in subway tunnels. He used spray paint, stencils, and once even mounted an entire projection screen underground for an impromptu art show. He wasn't a criminal in the usual sense. He called himself a story layer, said the tunnels were where the city's forgotten stories lived. When Miriam told him about Talia, he listened for nearly an hour without interrupting. A week later, He left something behind on the wall across from mile marker 28.7, just far enough from the main line to be unseen from a moving train, but visible if you knew where to look. It was a face, a girl's face, eyes wide, lips sealed, brickwork painted in such a way that it looked like it was covering her mouth. On the corner of the mural, in small red text, it read, "She was here. Who else was?" The image spread online. A photo of the mural hit local forums and started circulating with the tag, "Ain't Talia was here." It was quickly taken down by transit authorities, but not before it reached thousands of people, artists, activists, and curious strangers. Some called it exploitative. Others said it was the only thing that had made them care. But it wasn't the mural that shifted the case. It was what followed. 2 days after the photo went viral, a woman came forward. Her name was Janice Rowe, mid-50s, a hospital custodian from Queens. She'd been interviewed in the early days of the investigation because her Metro card placed her on the same train as Talia that night. At the time, she'd told police she didn't remember anything. But now, she wasn't so sure. She called the precinct late one night, left a message on the detective's voicemail. The next morning, she came in and sat down, shaking. She said she remembered a man, middle-aged, white, wearing an orange safety vest, standing at the far end of the car as they slowed between Station 14 and Station 15. He looked like a worker, but something about him felt wrong. No gloves, no flashlight, no ID badge, and he wasn't interacting with the train operator. He was standing near the emergency door between cars. Janice said she saw him glance over his shoulder, then tap twice on the glass. She wasn't sure who he was signaling until she noticed a girl, alone, younger, walking toward that direction. Glasses, hood up. She said the girl paused at the edge of the car, hesitated, then followed. Then the train jerked slightly. Lights flickered just for a second. When they steadied, both of them, the man and the girl, were gone. Janice assumed they'd switched cars. She thought about reporting it, but she didn't want to get involved. She had work in the morning, and when news of the disappearance came out, she convinced herself it wasn't the same girl. Couldn't be. That kind of thing doesn't happen here. But now she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the girl's face in the mural. Only now it wasn't behind brick. It was pressed to glass. The detective took her statement, quietly reopened several files, revisited early interviews where others had mentioned a man in an orange vest. Most had been dismissed as confusing him with legitimate transit workers, but now there was a pattern. And one more thing. Leo, the artist, sent a message through Miriam. He'd gone back down to photograph the mural again, but when he reached the alcove near mile marker 28.7, it was gone, painted over with fresh gray. Nothing else on the wall had been touched, not the old tags, not the rusted signage, just that section. But Leo had left a mark, barely visible, just under where the girl's eye had been. He'd carved something in chalk, a series of numbers, coordinates, and a date, 1986. That was the year they'd added the power conduit that supposedly sealed the maintenance corridor behind that wall, but maybe it hadn't been sealed all the way. And maybe it hadn't stayed sealed at all. The mural changed something. It didn't reopen the investigation in any official way, not at first, but it caught attention in places the case had never reached. Council members, transit unions, journalists with bigger followings. When the photo went viral, so did the hashtag. Talia was here became more than a rumor. It became a headline. Parents shared it. Commuters whispered about it. Calls started coming in from people who claimed to remember things. Most were noise. But one reached a reporter at the Brooklyn Ledger, and the story that followed was blunt. Sealed corridor may hold clues in teen subway disappearance. It named the city. It named the MTA. It mentioned the denied excavation request, and it ended with a quiet quote from Talia's mother. "I just want to know what's behind that wall." 2 days later, under pressure, the Department of Transportation granted conditional access to the site at mile marker 28.7. They called it a controlled exploratory inspection. Crews would be allowed to break open a 6-foot section of the tunnel wall under supervision during overnight hours. A full team of engineers, city inspectors, and transit officers would be present. No media, no family. The detective, still officially attached to the case, was allowed to observe. The dig began at 1 a.m. on a Thursday. Floodlights bounced shadows across the curved tunnel ceiling. Workers chipped carefully, layer by layer, through the concrete. The outermost coat peeled easily, applied recently, maybe within the last decade. Beneath it, an older layer, rougher, more weathered. A third layer followed that, marked with soot and what looked like fire damage, though no record of a tunnel fire existed in that zone. 3 hours in, the crew broke through to a hollow pocket, maybe part of an old ventilation shaft. It was empty. Just rusted pipework, capped ends, and a sealed air duct collapsed inward from age or pressure. A field tech ran a moisture meter against the wall. Readings were low, no airflow, no heat signature. The site was photographed, documented, and by 5:30 a.m. deemed cleared. At the surface, city spokespeople released a statement. The structure inspected was part of decommissioned utility infrastructure. No evidence suggests further excavation is warranted at this time. The story faded again. Public interest dipped. Social media moved on. But not everyone forgot. One of the men on that dig team, a contractor named Emil Vargas, kept something to himself. A detail he didn't share until weeks later, when he quietly contacted the detective after hours. He said that during the final hour of the excavation, as they exposed the deepest section of wall, his chisel hit something that didn't sound like pipe. It rang. Solid. Metallic. He cleared a narrow groove, wiped back the dust, and saw it. A square edge. Painted over, rusted shut, but unmistakable. An old iron doorframe, completely buried. No hinges, no handle, just the remains of a welded seam around the perimeter. Vargas had worked enough tunnel jobs to recognize what it was. He'd seen those kinds of doors before in Cold War-era stations, emergency shelters, electrical bunkers, even fallout storage from the 60s. Most had been torn out or repurposed, but not this one. This one had been deliberately encased. He called it out to his supervisor. The response was immediate. "Patch it, we're done here." Within minutes, fresh concrete was mixed and applied. No paperwork, no discussion. Just the phrase Vargas couldn't forget. "We're not touching that. Not now." When he asked why, the site manager said there'd been a call from upstairs. Something about structural integrity. Something about orders from the mayor's office. By morning, the site was resealed, crews were reassigned, and a formal memo was issued across the department halting all underground activity in that section of the Green Line, pending review of safety protocols and budget allocations. Behind closed doors, it was made clear. No further digs, no overtime, no exceptions. The detective filed a supplemental report including Vargas's statement. He flagged it to his supervisor. There was no response. The file was marked internal note only. It never made it into public record. Talia's mother never heard about the door. When she asked for updates, she was told the dig had revealed nothing, that her daughter had not been found, that in the city's words, there was no reason to believe the wall held anything relevant to the investigation. She stopped asking after that, but the detective didn't. He started digging in a different way, through archives, city planning records, budget reports from the late 90s. He found something odd. In 1997, a last-minute amendment to the subway restructuring plan added $42,000 in unexpected material costs for Tunnel Segment D, which included the stretch between stations 14 and 15. The expense was never itemized, and no permits were issued for any concrete work that year. It wasn't just a sealed wall, it was something that had been hidden, something built over, quietly, and never meant to be opened again. And the city had made sure it stayed that way. By early 2016, the case was cold, officially. The file had been boxed, indexed, and moved to the 5th floor of precinct storage, where unsolved disappearances collected dust under plastic labels and forgotten dates. Talia Brenner's name was still known by a few officers, but the active investigation had long since stalled. Leads went nowhere. The tunnel wall was sealed. There was nothing left to chase, until a transfer changed that. Detective Elena Ramirez arrived from Queens South in March. She was sharp, methodical, and known for revisiting cases that didn't sit right. On her 3rd week, she pulled the Brenner file, not because she was assigned to it, but because she remembered the story. She'd been a patrol officer in Brooklyn when Talia vanished. She still remembered the flyers, still remembered the mural before it was painted over. The report had holes, and Ramirez didn't like holes. She began by mapping the timeline again. She wanted to know every confirmed detail of Talia's movements, every witness, every train, every response by the MTA. But as she worked, something began to pull at her. The tunnel. That blind, unmonitored stretch between stations 14 and 15. It had been part of the story from the beginning, but everyone had treated it like a fluke, a glitch in coverage. Ramirez didn't see it that way. She saw a pattern waiting to be drawn. She went back through the precinct's archives, pulling missing persons files that had been filed within 5 miles of the same subway line. She focused only on teenage girls and young women, non-criminal, non-custody related, with unresolved outcomes. There were dozens. Most were explained: family issues, confirmed runaways, relocations, reappearances. But 4 weren't. 4 unsolved cases, all between 1992 and 2007, and all disturbingly close to the very tunnel Talia had disappeared in. Ramirez opened the first file, May 1992. A 19-year-old named Karina Miles vanished after leaving her apartment in Bed-Stuy. She was headed to her shift at a diner near Station 13. Never arrived. No witness accounts, no security footage. Her landlord said she was wearing her work uniform and had her Metro card in hand when she left. The card was never used. The second was dated November 1998. A 16-year-old named Aisha Walton left an after-school tutoring session at the Brooklyn Learning Center, a block from Station 14. She sent a text to her cousin at 6:21 p.m. On the train now. Her phone went dead 10 minutes later. Investigators had blamed the family, citing past disagreements and poor communication. But the cousin insisted Aisha was upbeat that night, excited for the weekend. She was never seen again. The third file belonged to Angela Foster, age 18. It was 2003. She worked as a clerk at a newsstand inside Station 15. She clocked out at 10:03 p.m., walked toward the northbound entrance, and disappeared. One man later came forward claiming to have seen her speaking with a subway worker in a reflective vest, said the man was pointing toward a side corridor. Angela had looked confused, maybe even scared. No badge was visible. When the man was asked to describe him, he only remembered that his beard was uneven, his voice was slow, and he carried a metal toolbox. Angela's case had never been formally linked to any foul play. The final file was dated September 2007. Jasmine Lee, age 20, was a college student at City Tech. She lived off Flushing Avenue and regularly took the Green Line to campus. She disappeared on her way home after an evening lab session. The last confirmed sighting was a friend waving to her as she entered the turnstile at Station 12. The train logs showed it departed on time. She was never recorded exiting. Ramirez laid the files out across her desk. All 4 girls were between 16 and 20. All vanished within 3/4 of a mile from the same tunnel, all between early evening and late night. 2 were heading home. 1 was coming off shift. 1 had just left class. 3 had no confirmed exit points. 2 were last known to be on trains that passed through the same tunnel stretch as Talia. And then there was the man in the orange vest. It was in the Foster file, the only one with a witness. The man who claimed to have seen her speaking to someone in a subway vest had described him casually. The detail hadn't seemed important. At the time, no record matched. Transit supervisors chalked it up to confusion. No follow-up had been conducted. Ramirez checked uniform logs. In 2003, MTA vests were distributed in controlled batches. Serial numbers were assigned. But there were gaps. Unreturned gear, unofficial hand-me-downs, workers who left abruptly and never turned in equipment. She cross-referenced names, found no clear matches. But something in her gut shifted. She wasn't looking at isolated incidents. She was looking at a footprint. It was narrow, deliberate, and hidden in the gray space between maintenance and neglect. Someone had found a place where surveillance didn't reach, a place where young women passed through alone, distracted, anonymous, a place where the doors sometimes opened when they weren't supposed to. Ramirez wrote a memo to her captain, outlining the findings. She called it Pattern of Concern, Green Line Disappearances. It was sent upstairs, but she never got a response. And when she called to follow up a week later, she was told the file had been rerouted to internal review. That was all. No further comment, no follow-up call, just silence. Again. But Ramirez had seen enough to know it wasn't coincidence. Someone had been watching that tunnel long before Talia ever stepped onto the train, and if he was still alive, he still knew how to vanish. Detective Ramirez kept digging, even when the paper trail thinned out and the department's interest quietly pulled back. Her instinct told her that if the pattern was real, and she believed it was, then someone had been moving beneath the radar for years. She needed a name, something to make the invisible visible. She began requesting transit employment logs from the 1990s, narrowing her focus to night shift workers assigned to the tunnel stretch between stations 12 and 15. Most files were dry: foremen, electricians, structural engineers, people with years of clean service, retirement records, pension trails. But one name stalled her hand as she flipped through a scanned personnel report from 1998. Lyle Conrad, independent contractor, assigned night maintenance detail, 4 nights per week, from 1993 to early 98. Not an official MTA employee, but contracted through a third-party vendor that had since gone out of business. His role was limited: routine inspections, minor electrical work, debris clearing. What stood out wasn't the job description, it was the termination notice, filed April 12, 1998. Reason: breach of conduct during active shift. The narrative was vague: no charges, no court record, but attached was a confidential internal memo stating that a female intern had accused Lyle of inappropriate contact inside a closed utility corridor during after-hours inspection. No cameras, no witnesses. She had been relocated. He was let go. Ramirez scanned the margins of the file and saw something stranger. Lyle had never returned his uniform. The vest and ID were both marked unrecoverable. She pulled his last known address from the file, a small one-bedroom rental in Brownsville. Records showed he lived alone. His emergency contact section was blank. The address was flagged in FDNY records. In 2002, 4 years after his termination, the residence was destroyed in a house fire. Arson was suspected, but no suspects were named. A partial male body was found in the debris. Unrecognizable, no dental records available. Based on clothing fragments and a wallet found nearby, the coroner listed the victim as Conrad Lyle, age 47, case closed. But the autopsy file made no mention of fingerprints, no DNA confirmation, no biological match. He was presumed dead, not confirmed. Ramirez began searching for next of kin, but Lyle had no listed family, no marriage, no children, no siblings on record. His social security number hadn't been used since the fire. As far as the system was concerned, he simply ceased to exist. But someone else remembered him. She tracked down an older employee from Lyle's contract years, Gordon Redman, now in his 70s, living in Staten Island. He remembered Lyle well, said he was quiet, worked alone, kept a small metal toolbox with his initials scratched into the lid. Not much of a talker, always volunteered for the overnight shifts no one else wanted. Redman never knew why he was fired. Word was he got into something with one of the new hires, that's all they told us. But then Redman paused, looked down, told her something he hadn't told anyone. He thought he saw Lyle again, years after the fire, maybe 2006 or 2007. Couldn't say the exact date, but it was late, after midnight. Redman had just finished visiting his brother at a rehab clinic in Manhattan, took the southbound Green Line home. The car was mostly empty, quiet. Somewhere between station 13 and 15, the train slowed briefly. When it did, he looked out the window and saw a man standing near a side panel on the wall, half lit, hunched, holding something heavy in his left hand. It wasn't the face that struck him. It was the vest. Orange, dirty, frayed at the seams, but unmistakably one of the older safety vests issued before the department switched over in '96. The newer ones had reflective tape across the shoulders. This one didn't. Redman knew because he still had his, packed away in a bin in the garage. I remember thinking, that guy's wearing mine. He didn't report it. It was just a second. A blur between lights. Could have been imagination. Could have been anyone. But after reading the news about Talia, after seeing the mural and the coordinates and the whisper about the man in the vest, He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been Lyle. Ramirez submitted a request for a forensic audit of the 2002 fire. It was denied. No active investigation, the form read. She tried contacting the coroner who signed the death certificate. He'd passed away 2 years prior, but she kept the name, circled it in red ink at the top of the file. Conrad Lyle, fired for misconduct, presumed dead in a fire no one solved, no DNA match. No confirmed body, no next of kin to ask questions. And if Redman was right, if that man on the tracks in 2007 had been Lyle, then someone who wasn't supposed to exist had been walking the tunnel again. Wearing the same vest, watching the same line, the one where girls disappeared, the one where Talia vanished, the one where the wall had been sealed just after he was gone. And if he hadn't died in 2002, then someone, somewhere, had helped him vanish, and maybe helped him come back. In early spring of 2024, nearly 10 years after Talia Brenner vanished, the city approved a long-overdue renovation project along the aging Green Line. Heavy winter rains had pushed groundwater into the older tunnel joints, and inspection crews reported signs of erosion near several pressure points between Station 14 and Station 15. The project wasn't part of any investigation. It was routine, structural, just maintenance. No one expected to find anything. The crew assigned to the stretch at mile marker 28.7 arrived just after midnight on a Tuesday. 5 workers, all contractors, brought in under the city's emergency infrastructure grant. Their job was simple: drill through the damaged concrete, reinforce the wall behind it, and install a new support bracket for the overhead cables. They marked the drill point, measured depth, and began cutting. Within minutes, the lead operator radioed for backup. He hadn't hit water, he hadn't hit air, he'd hit metal. The drill screamed briefly, then stopped cold with a clank that echoed sharper than rebar. A strange resistance, not rock, not pipe, something flat, unyielding. They pulled back and cleared the dust. Beneath the crumbling concrete was a solid iron panel, riveted, corroded, rectangular. It wasn't listed on any schematics. They reported the discovery to the site supervisor, who called it in. A city inspector was dispatched within the hour. By then, the crew had chipped away enough of the surrounding surface to reveal what it was. A door, old industrial, sealed from the outside. No knob, no visible hinges, just the outline of a frame and the faint remains of white stenciled letters long since worn away. The inspector authorized a forced entry. It took nearly an hour of cutting and wedging before the panel gave way with a hollow groan, releasing a burst of stale, metallic air that hadn't moved in decades. Behind it was a room, roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet deep, no windows, one overhead bulb, long dead. The air was thick, sour with mold and rust. Inside, they found a fold-out cot pressed against the far wall. Its fabric was frayed but still intact. Next to it, a dented filing cabinet. On top, an old tin mug, long dried. In the corner, a locker, its door ajar, hinges eaten by time. The floor was scattered with debris, empty cans, cracked plastic, a pair of boots too small for a man's feet, a broken radio with the dial twisted off, and beside the cot, perfectly centered on a small wooden chair, lay a folded green sweatshirt. It was pristine, clean, unfaded. The lettering across the front was still visible. Midwood. The crew didn't say anything for a long time. They didn't have to. They radioed for police. The detective assigned to cold cases got the call at 4:47 a.m. She was already awake. When she arrived at the site, she was escorted past yellow caution tape into the chamber. She didn't touch anything, just stood there and stared at the sweatshirt. It matched the one from the surveillance footage. Same size, same school, same software at the cuffs. The forensic unit arrived within the hour. They documented everything, scanned for prints, tested for blood, swabbed surfaces, cataloged fibers. Everything was bagged and boxed, carefully, slowly, as if disturbing the wrong thing might erase what was left. And on the far wall, behind the cot, someone noticed the markings. Tally marks, dozens at first glance, but on closer inspection, hundreds, etched with something sharp, maybe a nail or knife. Rows upon rows of uneven lines, all clustered tightly together. Some were deep, others barely scratched. One section had been rubbed out and started over, as if someone had lost count, or wanted to forget. They weren't just decoration, they were records. Time, days, maybe weeks, maybe more. The forensic team took photos, measured depth and spacing. One analyst whispered something that no one repeated aloud, but everyone heard. This wasn't a shelter. It was a cell. The cot's legs were bolted to the floor. The locker had no contents except for an old vest and an ID card so faded it couldn't be read. The walls had no insulation, just cold concrete, wrapped in silence. No one asked who had built the room, not yet, because everyone already knew what they were thinking. It had been sealed, on purpose, from the outside, and someone had lived inside it. Maybe not alone. 2 days later, the lab confirmed it. The sweatshirt had skin cells embedded in the collar. DNA matched Talia Brenner. Her mother was notified at home. She didn't speak for several minutes after the call. She just held the phone, hand shaking, then pressed it to her chest and wept. It wasn't closure, it wasn't peace, but it was proof. Talia had been there. She had survived, at least for a time. Inside that room, behind that wall, beneath the city. 2 days after the discovery, forensic teams returned to the tunnel with ground-penetrating radar and a new set of directives. What had started as routine maintenance was now a full-scale crime scene, one buried beneath decades of concrete and silence. The access chamber was treated with the caution of an archaeological site. No dust was swept, no rusted object disturbed without documentation. Because they all knew this was bigger than one sweatshirt. They weren't wrong. At the back of the room, beneath a warped floor panel partially hidden by debris, a technician's scanner pinged. Hollow space, less than 2 feet below the concrete. The crew cut carefully, layer by layer, until they struck something brittle. Bones. 3 separate skeletal remains, loosely scattered and partially fused into the sediment, not placed with care, not wrapped, just buried. The first appeared to be a female, late teens to early 20s. The second, a middle-aged male. The third, female again, likely mid-30s. None had any identifying clothing left. But dental records would later confirm the worst of them all. One of them was Talia Brenner. She hadn't been moved, hadn't been dragged somewhere else. She'd died right there, inside that room, just yards from where her folded sweatshirt had waited on the chair. The call to her parents came that same evening. The detective stood in their living room and told them the words no one ever wants to hear. We found her. Not alive, not rescued, just found. Her mother asked only one question. Was she alone? The detective shook her head. She wasn't. The forensics team continued sweeping every corner of the chamber, hoping for names, for dates, for anything that might connect the remains to the stories of other missing women from decades past. But what they found instead was something colder. Inside the dented filing cabinet, beneath a stack of flattened cans and a folded cloth bundle, they uncovered a metal folder, the kind used for maintenance logs, locked with a single rusted latch. Inside were torn pages, most written in cramped handwriting with a fine-point black pen. It wasn't a journal in the traditional sense. There were no dates, no names, no entries that began with today. But it was personal, detailed, disjointed. The handwriting analysis confirmed that it didn't belong to Talia, nor did it match any of the other known victims. But it did match one known signature, recovered from a job application filed in 1993. Conrad Lyle. The first few pages read like scattered thoughts, fragmented reflections, scribbled between diagrams of tunnel layouts and access schematics. But the tone shifted as the entries progressed, became more structured, obsessed. I was never meant for the surface. I've seen what happens to people up there, how they rot, how they forget. But down here, it's different. The air's cleaner in ways they can't understand. You can feel your mind return to its proper shape. One entry described the early construction of the chamber. He referred to it as the womb and detailed how it had once been used for temporary maintenance access during the 1970s, how he'd improved it, reinforced it with layered concrete, added insulation, and secured the outer door so no one could interrupt the work. Another page read, I was given purpose. I was meant to find the broken ones, the silent ones, the girls who were already fading from their world. I didn't take them. I saved them. He wrote of cleansing, of removing the outer noise so they could hear their true names again. The language danced between spiritual delusion and calculated restraint, but the most chilling passage came near the end. She wasn't like the others. She asked questions. She didn't cry when I closed the door. She watched, always watched. She tried to leave. I couldn't let her. She screamed too loud. The last page was dated August 14th, 2015, a full 11 months after Talia vanished. For almost a year, maybe longer, she'd been alive inside that room, breathing the stale air, counting the days, listening to footsteps overhead that never stopped long enough. No one knew how long the others had lasted, but Talia had been the last, the one who didn't escape. There were no signs of blunt force trauma on her skeleton, no knife wounds, no gunshot. The forensic pathologist listed cause of death as undetermined, but dehydration or suffocation were considered likely. Starvation possible. Trauma certain. The door had been welded shut from the outside, and when the final tally marks were counted on the wall, 362, someone finally understood. She'd lasted almost a full year, one scratch at a time. And when the food ran out, when the voice behind the door finally disappeared, she kept counting. Because maybe someone was coming, because maybe someone would finally hear. But the city didn't. Not until the wall cracked, and the truth buried beneath the tracks began to rise. The forensic reports took weeks, but the conclusions were unflinching. The DNA pulled from the three skeletons confirmed what some feared and others had tried not to believe. One set of remains belonged to Talia Brenner. The other two were identified as Angela Foster and Jasmine Lee, young women whose disappearances, long buried in the backlog of missing persons, had haunted their families for over 2 decades. For Angela and Jasmine, no one had ever found a trace. Their names had faded from public consciousness, reduced to file numbers and unanswered calls. Now, years after their faces had vanished from flyers and bulletin boards, they had been found, entombed beneath the tunnel where they'd likely taken their last breaths. The confirmation came like an aftershock, not just one victim, not just one tragedy. It had been happening for years, and one man had been behind it. Though the remains of the third adult male couldn't be conclusively identified by DNA, the fire in 2002 had left no medical reference samples. The bone structure, approximate age, and trace tool markings on the jaw were enough to narrow the profile. Dental analysis aligned with one man, Conrad Lyle. Investigators worked backwards through tunnel maps, city contracts, abandoned permit logs. They traced his access to the chamber's original layout, cross-referenced against the locations of missing persons over a 15-year span. Piece by piece, the picture formed. Lyle had exploited his knowledge of the subway system. He'd used maintenance corridors long erased from modern schematics, passageways abandoned after the city overhauled its electrical systems in the late 90s. Some had been sealed, others, it turned out, never were. In 1996, shortly before his termination, he began construction on what he referred to in his journal as the womb. He used discarded materials, scrap paneling, stolen conduit, and old iron sheeting, likely dragged down during late-night shifts when no one was watching. He reinforced the door with poured concrete, then layered false panels on the exterior wall to disguise the entrance. From the outside, it looked like structural reinforcement. From the inside, it became a tomb. He worked alone, posed as a transit employee long after his termination, slipping through tunnels with forged IDs and a vest no longer in circulation. To the untrained eye, he looked legitimate, just another worker in a system so large, most didn't question who belonged where. Witness statements gathered from years past, once dismissed as unreliable, were now revisited. One woman had seen a man in an orange vest gesturing toward a tunnel wall. Another had described a worker who didn't speak, who avoided eye contact, who led someone off the train in the seconds before the doors closed. At the time, no one connected the dots. There hadn't been enough to connect. But the journal filled in what the cameras never showed. Lyle hadn't picked random victims. He watched, waited, chose girls he believed needed to be saved, his words, not theirs. He didn't see them as people. He saw them as subjects, testaments to his delusion. For years, he operated in silence. Then, sometime in 2015, after drawing his final journal entry, he died inside the chamber he had built. No one knows how. There were no clear injuries, no sign of struggle. He may have starved. He may have taken his own life. What was left of his body was buried in the corner beneath a thin layer of old insulation. Authorities believe Talia survived for days, possibly weeks, long enough to leave behind skin cells in the fabric of her sweatshirt, long enough to make the tally marks on the wall, long enough to scream. Her death, they now say, likely came after an escape attempt. Lyle's journal had confirmed as much. She tried to leave. I couldn't let her. She screamed too loud. That was the last sentence he ever wrote. In the months following the discovery, city officials held a press conference. They named all 3 victims, explained the timeline, recounted the evidence. They confirmed what had been denied for years, that this wasn't a single tragic accident. It was a sequence, a pattern, a crime scene that had existed beneath the city's feet for nearly 2 decades. The case was closed. There were no accomplices, no remaining suspects, no one left to arrest. But there were consequences. The tunnel wall at mile marker 28.7 was rebuilt under new guidelines, structural integrity reinforced, cameras installed, access sealed, not hidden, sealed. And for the first time, the city installed something else, a plaque, small, steel, mounted low on the tunnel wall where few would ever see it. For the ones who were taken beneath the city, we see you now. Trains still pass through that stretch. Riders still glance out the windows without knowing what was once behind the wall. But those who followed the case, the families, the workers who found the chamber, the detectives who never stopped pushing, remember exactly what had been buried there. Talia Brenner never left the subway. She was entombed beneath it, and the truth stayed sealed behind concrete for nearly 11 years, until time, water, and a cracked wall gave her voice back. ChatGPT can make mistakes, check imports,